Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Grayzone. Here with Aaron Mate, as always, or as usual. And we're on Rumble. Really encourage you to follow us on Rumble because YouTube is demonetizing us so heavily. I think we're on Rockfin. Remember Rockfin? You know, that's the site where you get paid in some kind of version of Bitcoin. We're on Twitter. And we're also on YouTube. We watch our language for YouTube because they still control everything. If there are any YouTube whistleblowers out there, anyone inside YouTube's content management team, you want to speak to us, our email is grayzoneproject@gmail.com. We have a public email form on our site. You can reach us there. You can DM me. If you're involved in the censorship regime there and you want to tell us what terms are being censored, how things like the Amsterdam riots, how you're being content creators are being demonetized, as we have been for questioning the bogus disinformation propaganda of the official story. Hit us up. Aaron, how's it going?
How's it going, Max? How's it going, everybody? We have a lot to get to today. The Trump administration is taking shape, and everybody's upset. Like, anybody who supports genocide has ample reasons to be upset. And then you have on the other side.
Wait. People who support genocide like the administration, as they did the last one.
Sorry. Anybody who opposes genocide has ample reason to be upset because Trump is appointing a cabinet full of Israel firsters. But also on the other side, people who support genocide, they're upset too because some of their picks don't quite fit into the full neocon pro-war mold, like Tulsi Gabbard. So everyone's angry, and we're going to go through all the madness today.
Yeah, the Tulsi Gabbard selection as national security advisor has triggered the greatest freak out among the people that I consider to be the most malicious, invidious, and just frankly evil element in Washington. The bipartisan coalition of neocons. I mean, maybe except for Lindsey Graham, who is the leader of the World War III lobby, but is a Trump loyalist. So he's put aside his inveterate hatred for her. And Tulsi Gabbard's obviously, to put it lightly, a complex figure. We talked last Tuesday with Wyatt Reed and Anya Parampil about Pete Hegseth, who's nominated for defense secretary. We talked about Elise Stefanik, the Israel firster nominated for UN ambassador, and so many of these other picks. But then Tulsi Gabbard, Matt Gaetz, and RFK Jr. came down the pike. And these are figures who you would not normally associate with the Republican Party, who've been attacked heavily by the Republican Party in the past. Except for Matt, and Matt Gaetz, has his own share of enemies within the Republican Party, but they're basically anti-establishment figures who also have serious flaws. So the freak out on Tulsi Gabbard really reminds me of, I feel like we're all of a sudden we're back in the COVID era and we're back in the Russiagate era. And it reminds me why I just hate resistance liberals, because they're such McCarthyite liars and such warmongers. This is Elizabeth Warren, who, is considered one of the more progressive members of Congress.
Many things I disagree with Marco Rubio on, and I haven't decided yet about voting for him, but he is qualified. He has experience. We may have differences that would cause me to say, I don't think that he should be Secretary of State, and we'll go through that. We'll listen to the hearings. I want to hear very carefully from him. But what we're talking about with people like Matt Gaetz is very different from what we're talking about with people like Marco Rubio. And we just have to keep that in mind. But do understand with Matt Gaetz, and you've already made this point, he's not the only one out there who is unqualified and who raises whole questions like Tulsi Gabbard does. You really want her to have all of the secrets of the United States and our defense intelligence agencies when she has so clearly been in Putin's pocket? That just has to be a hard no.
So she's clearly in Putin's pocket. They're all praising Marco Rubio, by the way, the Democrats. Your boy Chris Coons, I saw him on MSNBC, and he was just like gushing praise for Marco Rubio. But she's clearly a Russian asset. I mean, this is the line that we get again and again and again. This is basically an official Democratic talking point. I mean, here's the lady who ran the DCCC, Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, and was a DNC official, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, on Tulsi Gabbard.
Tulsi Gabbard is someone who has met with war criminals, violated the Department of State's guidance, and secretly, clandestinely went to Syria and met with Assad, who gassed and attacked his own people with chemical weapons. She's considered to be essentially by most assessments a Russian asset, and would be the most.
Is that how you consider her? Is that what you consider her?
Oh yes, there's no question. I consider her someone who is likely a Russian asset, who would be as the DNI responsible for managing our entire intelligence community, hold all of our most significant intelligence information and secrets, and essentially would be a direct line to our enemies.
So she's just straight up calling her a traitor, basically saying she's guilty of conducting espionage for an official American enemy, which could carry the penalty of death or certainly life in prison. And here's Abigail Spanberger, who's one of the Democrats from Northern Virginia, where all the money that comes in through the MIC and intelligence world for contractors. She's in a heavily liberal district. The CIA basically got her that seat. There are all these CIA Democrats running in deep blue liberal districts. And here's what she has to say on Tulsi Gabbard.
The specifics of the DNI role, someone who has aligned herself previously with Russia, with Syria, with regimes the world over, is not in a position to have, or should not be in a position to have any of the information that is, America's greatest secrets. And just to.
So it goes on and on. She's a case officer. Tulsi Gabbard was actually in a combat role in the Anbar province of Iraq. Abigail Spanberger always campaigns on how she served America. She's taking up the mantle of patriotism against this Russian asset, Tulsi Gabbard. Aaron, what's your reaction to this obvious talking point that Tulsi Gabbard is a Russian asset? And what does it say about the Democrats that this is their red line of opposition to her?
We've been talking about this since 2016.
Yeah.
Not only is this moronic and it's neo-McCarthyite, it's also politically self-defeating. How has this worked out for Democrats to accuse all their political opponents, whether they're on the left or the right or wherever, of being Russian agents? It's been a disaster politically, and they refuse to learn any lessons. And so is this the new reality now, where just anybody who dissents from the party line is going to be accused of being an agent of Russia? And there's so many ironies here. The fact that people who are assets of Israel, actual assets like Debbie Wasserman Schultz, accusing other people of being foreign assets. Russia hasn't given Tulsi Gabbard any money. How much money has Debbie Wasserman Schultz received from lobby groups like AIPAC for her services in defending a foreign apartheid state? So there's irony upon irony here. And it's also just politically self-defeating. And what does this all do politically? It contributes to a climate where anybody who questions official narratives and anybody who advocates diplomacy, as Tulsi Gabbard was once known for doing, is going to be smeared as a puppet of a foreign government, so long as the government is an official enemy of the U.S. It's been a disaster politically for the Democrats and a disaster geopolitically for the world, because this neo-McCarthyite Russiagate climate played a major role in fueling the tensions that led to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And Democrats are showing no signs of learning any lesson from that. And there's no one in the party to call it out. I mean, we have the clip of AOC also playing along with this. You know, if we had a genuine progressive element of the Democratic Party, there could at least be someone who consistently across the board could be calling out militarism and smearing people as puppets of a bad guy state. But there's nobody willing to do that. There are Democrats like, you know, Rashida Tlaib, who are very brave in standing up to the Israel lobby, and that's great. But no one who consistently across the board applies the same critique of U.S. hegemony to every situation. And so therefore, they play along when someone like Tulsi Gabbard falls outside the bounds of acceptable debate and, you know, accuse them of being Russian agents. It's bleak.
Yeah, there's no Democrat who actually stands up against the whole system of empire, of the military-industrial complex. There are no anti-war Democrats who are in Congress, no real anti-war Democrats, although they're anti-war on some issues. And this is AOCIA with Joy Reid, famous historian of Soviet Yugoslavia.
And we haven't even gotten to Tulsi Gabbard potentially having access to national security information, and Russia loves it.
She's geared up.
I actually think almost more than Matt.
She looks geared up here. I mean, she's like just going like partisan, balls to the wall. She was sent in there by Pelosi.
I think almost more than Matt Gaetz, Tulsi Gabbard's appointment is devastating. And
devastating.
Tulsi Gabbard's nomination, as much as she says that she's an anti-war person, she's not.
Yeah.
She supports very pro-war individuals,
including in Syria.
And let's be very clear, a Tulsi Gabbard nomination is a pro-war nomination globally, point blank, period.
As is Donald Trump as president of the United States. And we have
very articulate case against Tulsi Gabbard. It's a pro-war nomination globally. We don't know what she's going to do, and we're going to talk about some things that might be wrong with her. But the Democrats, even their most progressive faces and voices, are incapable of opposing Tulsi Gabbard for what's actually wrong with her. They're opposing her on the basis of the best things about her, which we should have expected and hoped for from a Democrat acting in the tradition of John F. Kennedy, brokering peace with official enemies and turning down the temperature on a Cold War. Tulsi Gabbard was the only Democrat who used terms like the new Cold War. Her going to Syria was one of the most courageous moments I've seen of any elected U.S. official. And when she returned, and I wrote about this in my book, The Management of Savagery, I went to a press conference she delivered only with, I think it was a Republican from New Hampshire or something named Peter Welch, sort of more independent on foreign policy, and introduced a bill to ban the CIA and Pentagon from sponsoring Al-Qaeda and its allies in Syria. I mean, this is one of the biggest scandals in American foreign policy in recent years, that our tax dollars were given to the CIA for a black budget to fund literal Al-Qaeda jihadists in Syria to rampage through the country, to carry out ethnic cleansing campaigns against religious minorities, and to just wreak havoc. The U.S. dumped one out of every $13 into the CIA's budget, dumped it into weapons in Syria across the Turkish border to just tear the country to shreds. And Tulsi Gabbard was the only legislator to actually stand up against it. She only got 13 co-sponsors, and then she was ruthlessly attacked by the usual suspects, the neocons like Josh Rogan at the Washington Post, as a foreign Russian, Syrian asset, the same stuff we get, for doing something that's just basic, fundamental anti-war activity. That and no American actually supported that policy, except for people who had skin in the game or who were like Syrian emigres to the U.S. who really wanted revenge on Assad, the same way Miami Cubans do on the Fidel and on the Cuban Revolutionary Socialist government. So that's really where it began. And then she goes on to take out in the Democratic primary. She basically takes out Kamala. Kamala's whole campaign was a house of cards. Tulsi Gabbard comes along and calls her out for jailing large numbers of young black people, and particularly black men, for minor marijuana crimes and truancy. And she just pulls one card out in the debate, and the whole house of cards of Kamala's expensive campaign collapses, and they could never forgive her for that.
No.
And so they started like remember, I think it was Hillary Clinton who first called her a Russian asset.
Yeah, and then Tulsi called Hillary Clinton the queen of warmongers, and they also could never forgive her for that either. They also couldn't forgive her for speaking out early on against the rigging of the primary against Bernie Sanders. That was one of the reasons she resigned from the DNC. At the time, she was a rising star in the party, but she couldn't be forgiven for taking anti-war stances. And the reason why this discussion about Syria can still happen is because there's been just so much propaganda about it, and no one, with few exceptions, understands what actually happened. As you mentioned, one of the most expensive covert wars in CIA history. Jake Sullivan wrote to Hillary Clinton. This is all you need to know about Syria. He wrote to Hillary Clinton in February 2012. Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria.
Yep.
And because Tulsi Gabbard refused to side with Al-Qaeda and the CIA, she was demonized. And like, look at AOC talking about Tulsi Gabbard being pro-war. Tulsi Gabbard voted against the proxy war in Syria. What happened when AOC was asked to vote on the proxy war in Ukraine? Multiple times she voted to authorize tens of billions of dollars to fund the proxy war in Ukraine, never voting no, along with the rest of the squad and all the progressive Democrats.
Well, it's even worse than that. She actually prevented other members of the squad from voting against both aid to Ukraine and military aid to Israel in the recent supplemental by, in a hearing, demanding that they be separated out so they could vote for Ukraine aid and not vote for aid in Israel. And, talking to people close to the squad, they were furious that she did that because it prevented them from actually voting against both, because she's sort of seen as the leader of the squad. And she did it deliberately. But yeah, early on, I mean, she was cheerleading the $40 billion to Ukraine. And by the way, Jake Sullivan's wife, Maggie Goodlander, is one of those Abigail Spanberger CIA Democrats, national security state Democrats, who just got basically bought a seat in New Hampshire. That's what we're dealing with the Democratic Party. And that's
by the way, and who does AOC want in the job of Director of National Intelligence? Would she prefer someone like Jim Clapper, the first guy in the job who lied to Congress about spying on Americans, who lied about non-existent weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? He was working for the Bush administration, and he basically lied. He said that Iraq had WMDs, but that they had moved them into Syria. That was his excuse when they couldn't find WMDs. He said that Iraq had moved them into Syria. And then later on in his memoir, and Ray McGovern, the former CIA analyst, loves to quote this line, where Jim Clapper said that basically, we found evidence for something that wasn't actually there. So Jim Clapper admitted that he lied on behalf of the Bush administration. So is that
committed perjury?
Committed perjury. Is that who these people, including AOC, would prefer to be in the job of directing national intelligence, or someone who doesn't support knowingly arming an Al-Qaeda dominated insurgency inside Syria?
Yeah. Now I guess one more point that I wanted to emphasize was just how phony the Russia asset allegations are and where they emanated from. It started with Hillary Clinton. Then one of these bogus disinformation researchers, Carolyn Orr Bueno, remember, she started crowdfunding to go to Hawaii to investigate Tulsi Gabbard for her Russian ties, and that she was going to go to Hawaii. And she basically was fundraising so she could go on a Hawaiian vacation. I don't know if she ever went, and she never really turned anything up, but she raised money. And I think she probably just hung out on the beach in Hawaii. And this was someone who I think was quoted by NBC News and their disinformation and extremism researchers on Tulsi Gabbard being a Russian asset. And then, do you remember Goofy Grapes? Does that name ring a bell to you?
That was a pseudonym. That was a pseudonym for someone who donated to Tulsi Gabbard, right?
Yeah.
Who worked for?
Oh, here it is. Yeah.
But we know who it actually is.
Yeah,
right?
we do.
Yeah.
Here, this is one of these fraud reporters from the Daily Beast, Lachlan Marquet. Tulsi Gabbard's campaign is being boosted by Putin apologists. The Hawaiian congresswoman is quickly becoming the top candidate for the Democrats who think the Russian leader is misunderstood. Gabbard also got $1,000 contribution from Goofy Grapes, who listed his or her occupation as, quote, comedian, an employer at Redacted Tonight, a current events comedy show on Russian state broadcaster RT. So Goofy Grapes is a very funny comedian named John F. O'Donnell. I think he's got a few good new shows coming up. And he used to work with Lee Camp at Redacted Tonight. And so that was their evidence that Goofy Grapes donated $1,000. I mean, there's no RT anymore. And he was just a guy who worked on a comedy show inside RT, which was like the only alternative anti-war comedy shows that had a live studio audience. That's their evidence pretty much. And Caroline Orr Bueno's trip to Hawaii.
They also made a thing out of the late Stephen F. Cohen, one of the most influential scholars of Russia in the U.S., also gave money to Tulsi Gabbard. And they tried to make that a scandal as well. That was the climate we were living in the Russiagate era, and we're still living in it now.
We're still living in it now. Again, I feel like I'm living in the COVID era and the Russiagate era all over again, except that it's like living in those eras, but when I scroll through my phone, I just see an endless stream of dead children in a genocide presided over by the current Democratic president, who is barely there, which we'll talk about later. We don't know, Aaron, which Tulsi Gabbard would even show up if she somehow passed confirmation. I mean, and we can understand why she's hated so much from the time before she was fully ejected from the Democratic Party. I did a thread of some highlights from an interview she gave to Joe Rogan in 2019 before she was very well known. At this point, she was completely unknown to the MAGA Trump movement, largely unknown. And this was sort of her introduction. And what she said was fairly lucid for an American member of Congress. I mean, the bar is low, but she talked about Yemen. She talked about Iran. And what she said about North Korea, I thought was very important for viewers of Rogan to hear.
It may be easy to write him off as a maniac. There has also
She's
been
referring to Kim Jong-un.
Consistent. There has been a consistency throughout the different regimes of the Kim family as they've developed this nuclear and nuclear missile capability, in that they are doing it to protect themselves against regime change war, essentially. And they have said it directly. Our U.S. foreign policy experts point that out, that this is the reason why they're developing this capability, because they have seen how, if you look at Libya, for example, when Gaddafi was looking at, building and acquiring nuclear weapons, he was doing so also as, to protect himself and his regime. And then he made a deal with the United States saying, okay, give up your nuclear weapons program, and we're not going to, don't worry about it. We're not going to touch you. And then, of course, we know what happened. The U.S. led this regime change war, toppled Gaddafi, and North Korea says, okay, so that's what you do when you have, a leader of a country without nuclear weapons to protect themselves.
So, I mean, that was something you'll never hear, especially in today's Democratic Party, from a member of Congress. They don't understand that countries that are deemed as U.S. official enemies actually need deterrence because of the behavior of the U.S. and its vassals in Europe through NATO on the world stage, where they violate every treaty. They don't understand why Iran needs nuclear weapons now. They just think in terms of enemyism. And then Tulsi Gabbard, after October 7th, as she was being courted by the world of Donald Trump, reverted to a figure that she inhabited actually before she came out as a kind of pro-peace Democrat, progressive Democrat, which was as someone who had actually been courted by Christians United for Israel, gave a very belligerent speech at Christians United for Israel, someone who comes out of the Hindutva movement, which is sometimes more pro-Israel than Jews are in America, someone who was hanging out with Miriam and Sheldon Adelson and Shmuley. This was like going back to 2015, before she joined the Bernie campaign as a Bernie surrogate. And she kind of reverts to that figure at the pro-genocide March for Israel. This is...
There are tens of thousands gathering at the National Mall showing their support for Israel and to condemn hatred of Jews. One of those
condemn hatred of Jews.
Fox News contributor and former Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard. Great to have you here. What's the atmosphere like in D.C. today, Tulsi?
Thanks, Dana. I will be heading there shortly here from the studio, but on the way here, the roads are blocked. People are pouring in from all across the country to take this very important stand against anti-Semitism and against the Hamas terrorist Islamist groups that are vowing to exterminate not only the Jews, but sending this call to action to people around the world to go after and destroy and kill anyone who doesn't adhere to their radical interpretation of Islam. I got to tell you, there's a very loud absence, though, in knowing that President Biden and Vice President Harris are literally just down the street as people are traveling here from all over the country, yet they don't feel it's important enough to come and...
Yeah, I mean, Chuck Schumer was there. Like, the whole Democratic leadership was there. They're all owned. I mean,
Chuck Schumer was locking arms with House Speaker Mike Johnson.
Yeah. And Van Jones was there because he's basically a paid shill for the Israel lobby now. Probably not a fan of Tulsi Gabbard.
Stand with our fellow Americans to send this strong and resounding message at a time when anti-Semitic attacks around the world are at their height, that we will not allow it to continue, that we stand with Israel and the Jewish people. They are a reminder of why I left the Democratic Party.
Jews are a reminder of why you left the Democratic Party?
When she left the Democratic Party, when she left it, she didn't say anything about alleged anti-Semitism. She talked about the Democratic Party being a party of warmongers and being neo-McCarthyites and rigging the primary against Bernie Sanders. That's what she talked about. So this shift...
And Bernie rejected her endorsement. So I think she wound up endorsing Joe Biden.
She did.
Then she left. I mean, we can go on, but you get the point. And
so which Tulsi is going to show up as Director of National Intelligence? The Tulsi of, the 2016 to 2020 era, when she was talking about being anti-war, criticizing proxy wars in Syria and Ukraine, or this Tulsi who, when it comes to people who oppose genocide, adopts the neo-McCarthyite tactics of her detractors, calls them all anti-Semites and Islamists, and her characterization of Hamas as being this global Islamist group. It's such a lie. Hamas, whatever you think of them, they're an Islamist group opposed to occupation and seeking the liberation of their people with no global designs whatsoever. They're a very local group. That's why they don't do foreign operations. They're only strictly inside Palestine. So it just, like what she's saying is totally not, it doesn't make any sense. Yeah,
it's Islamophobic framing, playing into the critique of her leftist opponents.
Yeah.
Which is often a fundamentally correct critique. And, it was part of her belief system, but also part of the bargain she had to make to be a part of a future Trump administration. I think by that point, they were already sending the signal that if Trump won, she would be a part of the administration. And around the same time, that's when RFK Jr. started to come out as rabidly pro-Israel and pro-genocide. And he must have been getting the same kind of guarantees from the Trump administration or the Trump world that he would be welcomed into administration if he quit his presidential campaign and endorsed Trump. It's all part of the bargain you have to make, because Donald Trump himself is controlled by an Israeli asset in Miriam Adelson, who has this long history with both Tulsi and has a history with RFK Jr., has done events with RFK Jr., who we'll talk about in a second. So which Tulsi will show up? It matters, but as you pointed out, Aaron, Director of National Intelligence, and I wrongly referred to her as a nominee for National Security Advisor earlier. Director of National Intelligence is usually someone who is in the tank completely for the IC, for the intelligence apparatus, someone like Jim Clapper. And remember what happened to Chaz Freeman. He would have been the best Director of National Intelligence of our lifetimes, someone we've interviewed multiple times at the Grayzone, a real China expert, actual fair, objective China expert who was nominated by Obama, but someone who criticized Israeli occupation. And he was destroyed under orders from then Senator Joe Lieberman, the neocon Democrat. And Obama, of course, throws everyone under the bus. So what do we actually expect here? The thing about Tulsi Gabbard is that she doesn't come from the think tank world. She doesn't come from the world of the intelligence world. She's not some former CIA case officer like Abigail Spanberger. She's not from the military brass. So she's someone who brings a more independent background, and we know she knows the truth, but it's unclear whether she'll advance it or espouse it. So I'm at least here for the confirmation fight. I can't endorse Tulsi Gabbard. Because we don't know who will show up, whether she will actually sign on to a war with Iran at some point. I mean, it's possible that she could even do that. Just don't know where she stands on that issue. But she's someone who knows the truth and who didn't come from the same traditional national security background that we always see from DNI picks. And it's the same for several of Trump's picks, which is why we're seeing this meltdown.
Tulsi, called out one of the most blatant pro-war cover-ups of the century, which is the OPCW controversy, where the OPCW, the top chemical weapons watchdog, suppressed its own evidence, which found, according to the inspectors who went to Syria, that there's no evidence for a chemical attack in Duma in April 2018. And the OPCW put out a report that baselessly accused the Syrian government of committing that attack. Tulsi Gabbard called out that cover-up and called for transparency. Now, the Trump administration was the occupant of the White House when they accused Syria of this chemical attack in Duma and bombed Syria over it. So Tulsi Gabbard was challenging one of the Trump administration's biggest lies. And as Director of National Intelligence will have control over the actual evidence that was collected back in Duma, which I know the U.S. government has a lot of. So will she call for transparency over a cover-up that she herself called out, or will she do the bidding of the Trump team and stay silent on something she was very vocal about? I think it's pretty easy to guess what, but the fact that she did once have these, principal positions will lead to an interesting fight, because people who want to maintain silence and want to bury the facts will be very outraged as someone like her, who has once taken courageous stances, will be coming anywhere near the intelligence community. So the confirmation battle will be very interesting. And I agree with you. If we go by the most recent version of Tulsi Gabbard, there's no reason to be optimistic that she will act with integrity. Someone who, took the side of those endorsing Israel's genocide and smearing its opponents.
Yeah. It's going to be a very instructive series of confirmation hearings. I'll be discussing this, by the way, on Monday night with someone who's in the MAGA world, maybe debating it. Darren Beatty from, what is his website? Revolver, or forget what his website's called. It'll be me and Darren Beatty with Judge Napolitano moderating at Zero Hedge at 7 p.m. on Monday. And so we'll be discussing those picks, but, hopefully I'll have a chance to educate the audience a little bit on the role of the Israel lobby and on what's actually happening in Gaza and Lebanon and beyond. RFK, I think the freak out on RFK might be, I don't know where the freak out is greater, on RFK, Tulsi, or Gates. I would say the Tulsi Gabbard freak out has probably has probably overtaken the RFK freakout, and they're drowning each other out. But the RFK freakout, who is being driven by, the expert community that gained so much prominence during the COVID era. And it's, understandable or predictable that they would do this, because RFK has been nominated to be Secretary of Health and Human Services, something I did not expect Trump to do. It is one of the largest agencies in the federal government. And if he were to secure that nomination, be confirmed, it would be a coup. It would be a hostile takeover of someone who opposes all the interests that have dominated that agency. And so the confirmation fight over RFK, I think, will be intense. It'll be something we haven't witnessed before. Here's the freak out from Dr. Sanjay Gupta on CNN.
Steer clear of politics, but this really isn't about politics, because this is somebody who has been, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who has been pushing quackery, who has been pushing lies, who has been pushing conspiracy theories. You've been talking to experts in the health community, the medical community, preparing for him, RFK Jr., to be given some sort of role in health. What have they said to you?
Well, it's not often that the entire medical and public health community is going to be in lockstep on something, but they're pretty close on this in terms of their significant concerns, horror even. Somebody said to me today, I can't think of any single individual who'd be more damaging to public health than RFK. Keep in mind, I think if the reporting's correct and the job is the Secretary of Health and Human Services, that comprises the CDC. We just got through this pandemic, comprises the FDA, comprises the NIH. He's talked about wanting to basically strip funding for infectious diseases overall. Again, just coming out of this pandemic with concerns about other viruses and things out there. The challenge, I think, is that at the same time, there is this whole idea that we're not a very healthy country. We spend $4.5 trillion on healthcare, and we have some of the worst outcomes in the developed world. And our food supply and other things are partly to blame, things that he's talked about. So there's these kernels of agreement with regard to the medical establishment and the public health establishment in particular. But then there's these other things like Caitlin was just talking about that they're not alternative views, they are false views. People often say, well, these are alternative views. They're not. People say, well, look, I think maybe vaccines could be linked to autism. Fair enough. That was an issue that came up, and it was studied in these large studies, global studies involving hundreds of thousands of kids who were followed for over a decade to see if there was in fact a link. Some of the studies actually showed that you were more likely to have autism if you were not vaccinated. But the point being that issues are raised, issues were studied, and yet they still keep coming up. And I think that's one of the big concerns. That's a metaphor, I think, for other things that people are concerned about with him.
I think that independent journalism causes autism. There should be a study on that, but I mean, they're going to hit him on that pretty hard. That's Sanjay Gupta, who's CNN's supposedly apolitical doctor, who was spouting some of the most debunked lies of the COVID era. And that's what this is really about. It's not going to be about, the MMR vaccine. That's not why RFK is there. Sanjay Gupta, when he went on Joe Rogan, was kind of humiliated by Rogan and was unable to back up a lot of the quote unquote science against someone who is like an MMA bro who was a game show host. And it really humiliated the expert class. And that's when the attack on Rogan came down, spearheaded by the Rockefeller Foundation, which is very close to the intelligence world, and brought like 100 doctors behind Neil Young. Remember Neil Young? To condemning Rogan. They somehow found Neil Young, who we don't hear from him anymore. Like his brain is like 72% bong water at this point. I'm a fan of his, but come on, Neil Young. And Rogan suddenly toned it down. So there's a lot of resentment there against this whole world of alternative doctors, the Robert Malones who appeared on Joe Rogan, Rogan himself, and RFK. He's really at the top of the totem pole of people who questioned the whole COVID response from the beginning and basically got it right. And he's so hated by the whole expert class that got everything wrong and saw its credibility collapse in front of the eyes of millions of Americans. There are millions who still follow them, who still believe in them, who are closer to the expert class, like people who have graduate degrees and believe in credentialism, many people on the left. But I don't even want to get into a debate on whether RFK was right about this or that. He's called for removing fluoride from the public water supply. Someone who is one of the biggest COVIDians, Dr. Liana Wen, who is on CNN all the time calling for banning the unvaccinated from public travel, from even like being on city buses, just isolating them from society, actually started to examine her own views and came out towards the end of the pandemic as someone who said that we shouldn't have done this. It was destructive. And she has an op-ed in the Washington Post declaring that RFK might actually be right about removing fluoride, that no country in Western Europe does this. But that's not the debate I want to get in. And anyway, I will be demonetized. I'll probably be demonetized for saying anything about this. The point I want to make about RFK is that, and I wrote this up on Twitter last night, is that he wouldn't be here if the expert class, if the Faucis, if the Sanjay Guptas, if the Francis Collinses at NIH, if the Javier Becerras at HHS, if the whoever that lady at CDC was, who was just like a PR operative, if they had gotten it right, and if Rachel Maddow had gotten it right about the jab, there would be no RFK. If you know RFK, he's pretty comfortable in the world of West LA. He has a famous actress wife. He's wealthy. He was, despite being a quote unquote vaccine skeptic, was pretty well accepted in the world of affluent liberals. He was loyal to the Democratic Party. He tried to run as a Democrat. But then COVID came along. He had his children's health defense, and he was the guy everyone looked to. And he called out the whole thing and said, this isn't going to work, and it's going to be deeply damaging to constitutional rights. And so I wrote that if the mRNA had not failed on its major stated promises, had the CDC and WHO not changed the definition of vaccine to accommodate those failures, had countless working class Americans not lost their jobs for refusing to take the jab, while others were basically forced to do so in order to maintain their livelihoods, and I know some who suffered injuries, had mainstream news hosts like Don Lemon and Jake Tapper and others, and Biden himself not proposed isolating the unvaccinated from society, condemning them for fighting for their freedom, and had the lockdowns, remote schooling not set a generation of kids from across all social strata back years in their education while not stopping the spread. Had our city centers, and we saw this here in Washington, D.C., not been transformed into terrifying zombie scenes where countless small businesses were shuttered, especially in D.C., it hit Black-owned businesses really hard. Well, we were constantly assured by Fauci that it would take just another week or two to flatten the curve. Had we not seen this dystopian state censorship regime consolidate its hold over every social media platform, including Twitter, which would have been completely off limits to people like us if Elon hadn't taken over. It's just a fact, whatever we think about Elon and his right-wing views. Had protesters, people protesting the lockdowns, not been demonized as terrorists and beaten and arrested. Had none of that occurred, RFK would still be safely ensconced in West LA. We wouldn't be talking about him right now. No one would care about him. All the Democrats wouldn't hate him. They'd consider him a quirky fellow who's still part of the Kennedy world and someone that they want to actually get close to. But that's not what happened. And we can't deny that this didn't happen. People can't keep just saying, oh, there were no real lockdowns. You're just denying the experience of millions and millions of Americans who paid the cost for the lies and the deceptions of the expert credentialed class. And now RFK stands to take over this gargantuan federal agency that, let's face it, traditionally has served as an instrument of big pharma and the agribusiness lobby. And who's leading it today? You see, they're saying, his critics are saying, well, he has no background as a scientist or as a doctor. Javier Becerra is a Democratic Party operative. He's a lawyer. He's not an expert himself. So the pundits who paint RFK's rise as this triumph of the paranoid style in American politics and right-wing extremism and medical quackery, they need to understand this would have never happened if they hadn't lied, if they hadn't spread disinformation. And there's a large segment of the public, part of it gathered in Washington for the Make America Healthy Again rally, which I thought was just like a sheepdogging spectacle and nothing would come of it. Most of them are like independent voters who follow Rogan and Russell Brand and other alt media influencers. That would have never come to bear. It would have never happened. That part of the public wants a reckoning, and that's simply why RFK is there. And I am not going to say that he's going to do anything to follow through on any promise. This is not an endorsement of him, and we've gone off on him on this show again and again for his genocidal views towards Palestinians, calling Palestinians the most pampered people in the world, repugnant views. But he's not in charge of any foreign policy, any part of Trump's foreign policy agenda. So let's at least put all of this in historical perspective and look at this with some level of sobriety, if possible. That's my take on RFK.
I stay away from RFK's views on all these health matters. It's just not my forte. But the part of your argument that I definitely agree with is like when you treat half the country with contempt, when you mock people, when you force people into conditions, and we saw the hypocrisy, like people like Gavin Newsom of California going out to fancy dinners while ordering people to lock down.
And disappearing when something happened to his face and he disappeared for 10 days and never explained it. Remember that?
Yeah. Or there was a top public health official in New York who was like telling everyone to lock down while still having, parties for himself and his friends. When you see that level of hypocrisy and that contempt for people who don't go along, you're going to have a backlash. And I think that backlash helped fuel Trump's victory. And now he's taking advantage by trolling his opponents by appointing people like RFK and Matt Gaetz at DOJ. Matt Gaetz, which to me is I think the most trollish pick of all, because Matt Gaetz is like an
epic troll.
Yeah, that's just a really big troll move. But that's but this is the payback. People also don't take into account the impact of Russiagate. When you frame the president as a Russian agent, when you weaponize the DOJ and intelligence agencies against him to constrain his presidency, when you repeat that again in 2020 by pretending that this Hunter Biden laptop was a Russian operation, people are going to be angry about that. And when their turn comes to go back in power, they're going to respond. And that's what I think Trump is doing now with some of these trollish picks. Someone like Matt Gaetz, who's obviously a hardcore Trump loyalist. But again, when Jim Comey was at the director of the FBI, he was sending his agents to the White House to entrap basically Mike Flynn which succeeded in getting Mike Flynn to resign, approving wiretaps of Trump campaign volunteers based on disinformation funded by Hillary Clinton, and treating everyone who voted for Trump as a malleable dupe of Russia, and basically endorsing this elitist view that anyone who turned away from Hillary and voted for Trump was just brainwashed by Russian memes. When you have contempt for so many people, they're going to be contemptuous of you and they're going to revolt. And that's what I think we've seen with Trump's victory in 2024.
Well, let's talk about Matt Gaetz, nominated for Attorney General. This is all about Russiagate, isn't it? I mean, what are your thoughts on it's partially revenge for Russiagate?
It's definitely revenge for Russiagate. Again, the DOJ was weaponized to undermine an elected president, and not only weaponized, but weaponized based on disinformation funded by his political opponent Hillary Clinton. We know now the FBI relied on the Steele dossier as source material for its investigation into the concoction of Trump-Russia collusion. So after seeing all that, after seeing, countless officials in the DOJ and the intelligence community, lie about Trump and his campaign, use their investigative powers to undermine Trump's presidency, he's taking revenge now by appointing someone like Matt Gaetz, who is a complete troll, who does have a questionable personal life. He's being accused of, sexual misconduct, of having sexual relations with a minor, and apparently has made some really crude comments to fellow lawmakers on the House floor. I mean, there's all these salacious allegations about him, and I don't know what's true or not. But what I do know is that Trump appointing him is it's an FU to the Russiagators, to the FBI, to people like Jim Comey, who bragged about basically using Russiagate to undermine Trump's presidency. So, people upset about Matt Gaetz need to start with reflecting on their own behavior when, for all their fears about Trump now weaponizing the DOJ and his image, what about their role in doing that when they were in charge, starting in 2016?
Yeah. And Kash Patel kind of fits in this category as well. Someone who's being put up for FBI, possibly considered for FBI director, who would do many of these same things. Investigating the Russiagate hoax is at the top of, always been at the top of Kash's agenda. He was a DOJ official under the first Trump term. Am I right?
He actually worked first under the Obama administration in the DOJ. And then and then under Trump, he was at the DOJ, but then also he worked for the House Intelligence Committee. And he was responsible for unearthing some of the initial revelations about the FBI's deceptions and lies to the FISA court and relying on the Steele dossier, where the FBI pretended as if it had sources beyond Steele and as if it had verified Steele's material and used that and concealed the fact, most importantly, that Steele was funded by the Clinton campaign. They concealed that from the FISA court to get surveillance warrants on Carter Page, which then allowed them to also surveil other members of the Trump world. So Kash Patel, and this is not disputed anymore, he was instrumental in uncovering all of that. And because of that, he's had a target on his back ever since. And yes, he is a Trump loyalist. There's no doubt about that. But the reason why he's treated with so much contempt, I think, in the intelligence world is because he exposed the FBI for committing fraud in pursuing Russiagate. And he's also been vocal about the role of CrowdStrike in all of this. CrowdStrike is the firm also paid for by Hillary Clinton that kicked off Russiagate by accusing Russia of hacking the DNC. And I've interviewed Kash Patel here at the Grayzone, and he's spoken about the key role that CrowdStrike played in the FBI's investigation. The FBI also relied on CrowdStrike as well, on top of relying on Steele, which you're not supposed to say. You're not supposed to admit that if you want to be accepted in that world. All this was covered up. So of course there's going to be animus towards Kash Patel for telling the truth about one of the biggest deceptions in U.S. history, which is Russiagate.
So here's what Kash Patel says he would do. And this is a tweet by obviously someone who's pro-MAGA, pro-Kash. Wants to implement a 24/7 declassification office, releasing files about JFK and 9/11. I don't think that's going to happen. It's up to the president. On day one, he would bring out Epstein's black book. I mean, this is all stuff for like the alt world that is not going to happen. I doubt it will happen. Wants to bring out Russiagate files that are hidden and expose the truth about the January 6th pipe bomber. I think that is a major reason why his name is being put forward, and Matt Gaetz as well. The January 6th pipe bomber is one of the pieces that Trump world believes can help kind of debunk the Democrats' narrative about January 6th, that it was not only a riot, but that it was a violent insurrection complemented by possible terrorist acts. And it is interesting that the FBI cannot find the pipe bomber who supposedly planted bombs at the RNC and DNC. And, you know, he's going to face enormous bureaucratic opposition from within the FBI and the intelligence world, which, I mean, it just needs to happen. Why do we even have the CIA? Why does it even exist? It's a secret government with something like a $100 billion black budget. It controls like a city within a city in Langley. We have no transparency there. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, no lover of peace, Democratic senator, senior senator from New York in the early 70s after the Vietnam War, proposed shredding the CIA and repackaging it within the intelligence arm of the State Department. So it's not only the anti-war forces that are proposing reform or ending the CIA, but something like this has never happened before. And, I think part of the freak out about Kash and Matt Gaetz as well is not about what they would do, but also just what they would say from a position like head of the DOJ or head of the FBI. Just listen to what Matt Gaetz said about Jeffrey Epstein.
Really? I do. I'm not going to say which one, but I don't think it was domestic inspired to take out of him. I think that was a foreign operation, government sponsored.
So foreign operation took out Epstein inside of our prison.
Yes.
So they must have been allowed to.
Oh, I think it was in concert with people in our government.
What foreign intelligence service could he be referring to there? Does it begin with M and end with D? This is stuff you're just not allowed to say.
Yeah.
So it is an epic troll. It'd be hilarious. Because what is Merrick Garland? Do the American people really want Merrick Garland?
Yeah, and again, also, this freak out about Trump weaponizing the DOJ. Beyond, so we talked about Russiagate. What happened after Biden and Merrick Garland took office? It was reported in the New York Times that Biden wanted Trump prosecuted. What did Merrick Garland do? They appointed special counsels who prosecuted Trump. Now, you could argue that a few of those cases were justified. The case in Georgia, which actually was at the state level, the classified documents case. But the case in New York over the campaign finance thing with Stormy Daniels, this was obviously political persecution.
Yeah.
And as we warned about at the time, on top of being, legally and morally flawed and hypocritical, it would also boost Trump because it would feed into his narrative as being persecuted by the deep state, which is exactly what it did. Look at Jack Smith now. Jack Smith was like, just as Robert Mueller was charted out as the savior figure, this white knight, Jack Smith now is packing up. He's packing his bags to leave with nothing to show for it.
Yeah.
So this is exactly so their obsession with Trump and their insistence on using these legal measures to go after their political opponents not only failed but also I think boosted Trump. And it's because they refused to be an actual political party focused on policies that help people's lives. I don't want to totally dismiss what the Democrats did. I do think on the domestic side, they took some positive steps. They lowered the price of prescription drugs. Republicans would never do that, or at least this version of the Republican Party under Mike Johnson and Mitch McConnell would never do that. They tried with the child tax credit, things I think are positive, but not enough. And they still relied on, people, this fantasy that Jack Smith would undo Trump. And they also were fanatically pro-war, whether it's fueling the proxy war in Ukraine and fueling the genocide in Gaza. And Trump has taken advantage fully of that. And now he's back in the White House.
It's such a good point. Like, nobody cares about what they have to say now. They've all been discredited. There's going to be mass layoffs at CNN. I think MSNBC might be put up for sale. Elon Musk could potentially buy it. Nobody cares. It all failed. The whole thing that they pushed for years and years, Russia, it failed. And then in the end, it was not only that Trump supports Russia, but that Trump is Hitler who tried to overrun Russia. And you had like the Atlantic magazine, pinhead neocons writing Kamala's script, and nobody cared about that because all they wanted were lower grocery prices. Actually, more Americans cared about the genocide in Gaza than they cared about any of these investigations, which who can keep track of any of these names other than you? Like I struggle to keep track. Bleeker and Gortman suddenly met with, I can't even remember the names of all of these Russian oligarchs that kept coming up. who all for some reason have citizenship in Israel.
Remember Lev Parnas?
Lev Parnas. That's who I was trying to think of. He was like
Lev
the big bombshell, Lev Parnas. I'm like, who the hell cares?
Yeah.
Here is
and the biggest con also is that, this was Trump took full advantage of this. So for example, in the closing days of this campaign, one of his big messages was that the fact that Democrats were campaigning with the Cheneys, and he tailored his message, especially to Arabs and Muslims in Michigan. He said to them, how could you vote for Kamala when she's palling around with the Cheneys, who are responsible for destroying the Middle East? And meanwhile, who is Trump appointing now to his cabinet? His national security advisor, Mike Waltz, used to work for Dick Cheney.
Yeah.
Which Mike Tracy pointed this out in announcing Mike Waltz. Trump omitted the Cheney part of Mike Waltz's bio. So it's like Trump took advantage, and he has his own con, because he's not opposed actually to the Cheneys when it comes to substance, but he's taking advantage of that the Democrats clung way more tightly to the Cheneys than Trump ever did, and the Cheneys turned on Trump and embraced the Democrats, and Trump has now exploited that to be back in power.
Well, there's a great video by a guy who's running for mayor of New York. I can't say I know much about him or that I endorse him, named Zohran Mamdani, illustrating the point that you just made. And I think this really shows where a lot of Americans, but particularly even Americans in big cities, deep blue big cities that are not being very well run, where the price of bus fare is a much bigger issue than Jack Smith's document fishing expedition, but also that have large immigrant communities, including people from the Muslim world who understand geopolitics on a much deeper level than most MSNBC hosts do, where people might watch the Grayzone over CNN. And I mean, I just think it illustrates the real America that the Democrats were not catering to, a part of America that was willing to not just take a chance on Trump, even though they know he might be a huckster, but just was sending a message of rejection to the Democrats that take them for granted. Watch this video.
To vote on Tuesday?
I didn't vote.
And why did you not vote?
Because I don't believe in the system anymore.
And did you get a chance to vote on Tuesday?
Yes.
And who did you vote for?
Trump. The $1 million question. Trump.
Trump. Donald Trump.
Well, actually, early voted. I voted for Trump.
Honestly, I didn't vote.
She voted for Trump.
I voted for Trump.
I voted for Trump.
Me too.
Before I voted Democrat, at this moment, I voted Donald Trump.
Hillside Avenue in Queens and Fordham Road in the Bronx are two areas that saw the biggest shift towards Trump in last week's election. Even more residents didn't vote at all.
They like Trump because they don't want the Palestinian, the brothers, they killed. The war in Ukraine, the Democrats giving all the money on the war. This is no good.
The swing is because people want lower prices. They probably believe that Trump will give them that.
Market crash, energy, gas.
La comida.
Food.
Most of these people are working families. They're working 1 to 2, 3 jobs, and rent is expensive. Foods are going up. Utility bills are up.
And that's your hope, to see a little bit more of an affordable life?
Absolutely. What Trump did in the first 4 years, Fordham Road saw something where Kamala couldn't do that.
There were young voters who didn't vote for her because of the genocide, and I wouldn't have voted for her if I did, but I did vote for her, obviously, because I have common sense.
Can you tell me a little bit more about why you didn't vote?
Since you're out here, Gaza, who should I vote? Either side will go ahead, send bombs from here to kill my brothers and sisters.
Palestine issue, and then other issues like Russia and then Ukraine. He stopped that war. That's why I voted.
You can't say you're a Democrat and stand for the genocide that's going on in Gaza. Period.
Practically, I like Democrat. I like Democrat, but I don't like this. Gaza, a lot of people are dying.
Have you voted for Democrats in the past?
I have.
And what would it take for you to vote for a Democrat in the future?
Being able to pay attention to the regular Americans and their economic needs.
They should make economics the forefront of their campaign. People were not really feeling it in their pocket.
I voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016. I voted against Trump also in the 2018 midterms. Insulting us, playing on our emotions. All they do is shame you, and they just want to use glitzy campaigns, and they get celebrities. And
if you're speaking the things that people want to hear about, I don't care what color you are. I'll vote for you.
We have a mayor's race coming up next year, and if there was a candidate talking about freezing the rent, making buses free, making
all right, well, here he makes the case for himself. But
he's the son, by the way, of Mahmoud Mamdani, professor at Columbia. Who?
Oh, really? Yeah. Okay, I know who he is now.
Yeah, who called out and exposed so many of the deceptions around interventions like the Libya war, also Darfur, back when the Israel lobby was helping to draw attention to the crisis in Darfur and using that to distract from Palestine. He also was calling that out as well. And so, comes from good stock. And that's a great video. It illustrates where real people are at, and the people who've been totally neglected and taken for granted by the Democratic Party.
Yeah. Mahmoud Mamdani's book, Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, helped inspire my book, The Management of Savagery. So glad someone went out and did that. Jeremy Lafredo of the Grayzone is actually working on a piece about the Bronx too right now. It's going to be a documentary about Richie Torres, the representative there in the poorest district in America, who was just basically owned by AIPAC, owned by Israel, while his district suffers. And he's just talking to real people in that district about the disconnect with their elected leadership. And he wins on the basis of like the wealthier enclaves in the Bronx, but everybody else feels like the party's completely out of touch. And when you show that to Democrats, they're not learning any lessons here. A lot of people were like, Bernie would have won. I saw Crystal Ball say that Bernie would have won. It's just like, get over it. It's over. Okay. Bernie didn't win. He lost because it was rigged against him, because the institutional inertia of the Democratic Party is dictated by the military industrial complex, corporations, and the nonprofit industrial complex that raises tons of money from those corporations to push just progressive social politics to the extreme, to the point where it just becomes a farce and no one can relate to it. So that's what's going on. And yeah, go ahead.
Well, Max, is a little awkward, but I recently said that Bernie would have won too. And that's not because I'm a diehard like Bernie supporter, but I just think, having a candidate who was somewhat anti-war and definitely populist, that in 2016, that was a moment and it was robbed from us. And the salient point from 2016 is, had Democrats ceded ground to the Bernie wing of the party in 2016, rather than embracing Russiagate mania and the neocons that came with it, things would have been different. I do think that's an important point. I do think personalizing it in Bernie is it's sad to this day, because Bernie, of course, was the first person to undermine his own power. Right after 2016, he could have said, "This should be. I would have beaten Trump, and you should listen to me now." Instead, he went along with all the Russiagate garbage and didn't assert control over a party that, had he really been committed to doing it, I think he could have at least made an effort to take control of. So I do think there's a lesson there, but certainly Bernie's not someone anymore to rally around, because he's refused to, seize the moment multiple times.
My point is, this party has entrenched interests that will not allow a Bernie to actually rise to a leadership position. So Zohran Mamdani is doing, I think, the maximum of what you can do, which is to run for a local position and to push anti-war politics at a local level. I saw the American Communist Party won a position in Vermont, which is said to have no power at all over policy. Forget what it is. But that's the thing to do. Okay. Credit to the American Communist Party for actually running for a position they could win in Vermont. And, people should be doing that and following the model of the Christian right, which built power from the school board up. The Green Party needs to be doing that. They are doing that. But at the national level within the Democratic Party at this point, unless there's a hostile takeover somehow, the party is really entrenching itself as the party of war. And they're reaffirming where they stand by opposing Trump's picks on the basis of hating the only good things that they stand for.
Yeah. I don't know if you saw that. It was reported in the Financial Times that Kamala Harris didn't go on Joe Rogan because she didn't want to anger some of her own staffers who are offended by that. And I'm not sure if that's just Kamala Harris's people trying to make excuses for her just not being brave enough to go on Joe Rogan, and so trying to throw lower level staffers under the bus. But if it is true, it does speak to just like how Democrats are in an echo chamber in which they refuse to speak beyond their own circles, their own like elitist coastal circles. And if that's the approach, it's going to be just a recipe for more failure.
It sounds so familiar to me. It's like when like Code Pink wouldn't allow Medea Benjamin to speak at the Rage Against the War Machine rally because Jackson Hinkle was speaking. It just sounds so familiar. It's like that whole rad lib left liberal element is obsessed with purity and what everybody thinks about them and isn't concerned with politics or getting things done. So I believe it's true. And then what's her name? Jennifer Palmieri. She's the one who was the source on that story. She had to walk it back because they like threatened to have her wash up in a river somewhere.
And whether that story is true or not, we know from 2020 when Bernie was endorsed by Joe Rogan, he was like viciously attacked for accepting Joe Rogan's nomination. And I can't remember if Bernie went on Joe Rogan or talked about going on Joe Rogan, but I remember like AOC was like trashing Bernie for accepting Joe Rogan's support. And how did that turn out for the progressives? So that sort of tribalistic thinking, where you treat so many people who are, just as American as you are with contempt, because they listen to Joe Rogan and don't maybe have the same views as you on every single cultural issue, especially. That's got to go if progressives want to have any chance of success.
Yeah, I mean, I'm done with all that, but you might be right. We'll see. Not to just force a black pill down everyone's throats, but I think power has to be built outside the Democratic Party or within the party at a local level at this point. Hey, I'm not leaving the country. I'm staying here. I'm right in the heart of the beast. I'm in the DC area. I'm not going to give up, but does feel rather hopeless. Do you want to talk? We did some Pete Hegseth on Tuesday. Should we do any more?
I didn't catch all Tuesday's stream. I mean, did you show that he's like an extremist Zionist zealot who, from Fox News, obviously? I mean, is there more to say about him than you covered on Tuesday?
Judge Andrew Napolitano worked with him for 10 years. And I hope he comes out and talks about him more because he really knows the Pete Hegseth story. It's pretty sordid. And, this was a guy who was a never Trumper before he realized that Trump was the path to power. And he was courted by the most extreme factions within the Israel lobby. We're talking now about Trump's nominee for defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, who wrote a book on becoming how to be an American crusader. And this is him in Jerusalem at an event sponsored partly by Ateret Kohanim, which is the group that raises money from the U.S. and around the world to colonize East Jerusalem, areas like Silwan, where Palestinians face violent home demolitions, and to eject people from their homes, indigenous Palestinians, and just put Jewish settlers in hours later. And he was taken on a tour of the most extreme settlements in the occupied West Bank. And he says one of the craziest things an American politician has ever said about Israel. I mean, there's a lot of competition because they're all competing all these American politicians are all competing to be Netanyahu's Shabbos Goy. Not that he observes the Sabbath, but you know what I'm saying. Listen to what he had to say.
And today, Jennifer and I and others had a chance to go see the Western Wall of the Temple Mount, the Western Wall tunnels, so much of the old city. And as you stand there, you can't help but behold the miracle before you. And it got me thinking about another miracle that I hope all of you don't see too far away. Because 1917 was a miracle, 1948 was a miracle, 1967 was a miracle, 2017, the declaration of Jerusalem as the capital was a miracle. And there's no reason why the miracle of the reestablishment of the temple on the Temple Mount is not possible.
I mean, that's apocalypse talk right there. He's basically calling for the destruction of the third holiest site in Islam and the construction of the third Jewish temple. He's endorsing the agenda of the most extreme factions of Netanyahu's coalition government, which is the most fanatical government in Israel's history. And you rarely hear someone who has any influence on a national level in U.S. politics going that far that I can remember. And since Aaron, I just saw that Aaron stepped away for a second.
Of all of Trump's picks at the cabinet level, he to me is the scariest because this guy is in charge of the Pentagon. So has anybody in history, I mean, or at least in U.S. history, been in such a high position with such fanatic views? If he is confirmed, I don't think so. I think he would be the most fanatic cabinet member in history. Maybe I'm missing something. I mean, like George Bush was an evangelical, obviously, but did he ever talk about Palestine in that way? No, he even actually referred to Palestine as an occupation. I think he understood there was an occupation. Pete Hegseth, whatever his name is, this is off the charts. Along with Mike Huckabee, Trump's potential ambassador to Israel, also off the charts in fanaticism.
Yeah, I mean, we know Huckabee. He's sort of a John Hagee Christian Zionist acolyte. He sees Jerusalem, occupied Jerusalem, as the future landing pad of the Messiah. And he's sort of more of a traditional Christian Zionist. Like you see when you're on a flight to Israel, you'll see them and they're wearing like logos or pins of Israel and America. They tend to be over the age of 60 or 70, travel in packs. They listen to whatever their tour guides tell them. Pete Hegseth's from another generation. He's from another wing of the Christian right. And he, to the extent that he really is following Christian values. I mean, there are some stories at Fox News that are pretty mind-blowing. But what he's saying there, what he's doing is he's endorsing the temple movement. The temple movement is supported by Itamar Ben-Gvir, the security minister, and Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, and is a movement that believes that the Jewish prayer that takes place at the Western Wall is actually heretical, and that Jews are not supposed to pray there. They're actually supposed to sanctify God up beyond the wall at what is now the Al-Aqsa compound, which needs to be destroyed and replaced with the third temple. And it is there that they will continually sacrifice sheep in order to sanctify God, as the Jews of the Bible did, as the original Jews did before the second temple was destroyed. And that requires religious warfare, a full-on religious war, which Pete Hegseth seems to represent in his tattoo collection. He's got a Crusader tattoo. Then he's got some Declaration of Independence tattoos on his arm. And the unit he served within Iraq. But it's like clownishness. It's complete clownishness. And to have a defense secretary like this, I mean, Aaron, let's face it, Lloyd Austin, he's basically under the influence of the Israel lobby. He has no power to resist anything Netanyahu wants to do. He's a political appointee and loyalist of Biden. Every defense secretary of our lifetime has basically done what Israel wanted, short of attacking Iran.
And Raytheon too. In the case of Lloyd Austin, he was on the Raytheon board and will be handsomely rewarded as soon as he leaves public office and returns to his old role.
Great point. I mean, and Patrick Shanahan, I mean, he was another defense lobbyist. All these guys walk through the revolving door. Pete Hegseth sort of comes out of nowhere. He comes out of the Fox green room. That's the same place Trump got John Bolton, by the way, into the defense secretary, onto that podium to speak to the world, into one of the most consequential positions in the world, because the Pentagon has bases, an archipelago of bases around the world. This discussion, if we were having this discussion and we were like Dutchmen or we were Canadians and we were talking about Canadian politics, nobody really would be watching from outside our country. But people are watching us now because we're talking about an administration that will have an enormous influence on what takes place around the world. And this clown will be the head of the Pentagon. the largest office building in the world. And so in a lot of ways, I can welcome this as lifting the mask on U.S. empire and lifting the mask on the Israel-U.S. special relationship and in doing great damage to it in the process. If I were an Israel lobbyist, I would be pretty worried about Pete Hegseth and what he could actually do to the perception of the U.S.-Israeli relationship, because it's all going to be out there now. And he has said that that Zionism and American national security interests are fundamentally intertwined, and that connection forms the foundation of Western civilization. He said that to a Israel lobby group. And he said that he fought not to prevent wars, but to prepare for a war on behalf of Israel that his sons, Gunnar, Boone, and Rex, would fight. I don't know if he was in a naming competition with Sarah Palin, but he said that. It's clownish in the same way that Elise Stefanik is just so making it so obvious. I mean, this is someone who wouldn't be known if she weren't serving Israel's agenda in Congress, browbeating class presidents for not banning Palestine solidarity student groups, for the same reason that Mike Huckabee lifts the mask. But every other U.S. ambassador to Israel has basically been an Israeli-U.S. reciprocal ambassador. Mike Huckabee is just making it so clear what it's all about. This is deeply damaging to U.S. soft power.
Yes. And this explains the animus toward Trump from the establishment. It's not really a policy difference, because what has Trump done except for say nice things about Vladimir Putin or Kim Jong-un that really differs from other presidents, like policy-wise? But he does lift the mask off. He does blurt out the wrong things. He does say things like, we're in Syria to take the oil. You're supposed to say we're in Syria to fight terrorism and spread democracy. And he appoints fanatics like this guy who do expose that what the U.S. really is, which is a global hegemon in alliance with the most extremist government in the world, Israel.
And not just an alliance, I think, like in many ways under the influence of.
Well, whatever the nature of the relationship, the point is they're in lockstep, and people like Antony Blinken will go out there and pretend to care about Palestinians while still perpetuating their genocide. These people won't. They dispense with the pretense of concern for human rights and all that. So yeah, in that respect, I agree with you that people like this, it is a mask off moment. The fanaticism at that level, the open fanaticism at that level, is something unprecedented, I think.
And that is why the Netanyahu inner circle, Netanyahu's cabinet, was quote unquote dancing the hora when Trump won.
And going back to Mike Wagenheim, Mike, just in the past hour, the Trump team confirming the pick of Mike Waltz as the national security advisor. And I don't want to exaggerate and say that Israel, the government here, and its supporters are breathing a sigh of relief over these picks. But certainly, I think some of the concerns they had about the next administration have been eased by picking certainly these three, and especially Marco Rubio, Mike Waltz, people who have, for example, spoken with I-24 News just in recent months about their strong support of Israel and their concerns over Iran.
Not just breathing a sigh of relief, Colin. They're dancing the horror right now at the prime minister's office with these selections by Donald Trump. I mean, we were expecting some isolationists possibly in those positions, or maybe some who lean at least a little bit toward Trump's new foreign policy and the MAGA foreign policy. Hasn't been that case at all. I mean, Rubio and Mike Waltz are in the mold of old school Republicans on policy, both pro-Israel stalwarts to the hilt. They'll challenge anybody who views the situation otherwise. I mean, you couldn't have selected two better picks, I think, if you're sitting in the prime minister's office right now. And Elise Stefanik will be a firebrand at the United Nations. She already told Isaac Herzog in a meeting this morning that she'll have Israel's back there. And we didn't expect otherwise, but always good to hear that if you're within the Israeli government in a very problematic institution like the UN. By the way, Marco Rubio told us last Tuesday at Donald Trump's watch party on election night that he with the Republicans taking over the Senate, not knowing then that he would be nominated likely for Secretary of State, he said that the Republican Senate should take up defunding more UN agencies that he feels are either in cahoots with Hamas or turn a blind eye to those terror organizations that operate in Gaza and elsewhere.
I love the vibe of I-24. It's like Jackie Mason's the anchor. The correspondent says Hamas. Like no one in U.S. media says Hamas. But there it is.
Maybe Jake Tapper. I think Jake Tapper does.
Oh yeah. It's like a code. It's like a secret handshake or something that you're on the side of Israel if you say Hamas. But there it is. I think that we're going to see a lot of those things come to pass. The Trump administration, Marco Rubio will try to destroy UNRWA. They'll defund it in the U.S. as they did in the first Trump administration. They'll do all of that. But there is a chance that Netanyahu will seek to end or find some exit ramp out of the Gaza quagmire and even Lebanon in order to deliver Trump a foreign policy win, in order to boost Trump, and that there's some kind of negotiation going on there. I think there is an outside chance. He did not want to give that to Biden. And Netanyahu clearly saw these wars as beneficial to Trump winning because it obviously depressed Biden's support from his base. Biden didn't care because he ideologically believed in it, which we'll cover in a second. And Trump is doing everything possible to signal his total fealty to the agenda that Netanyahu and his minions in the U.S. want to see enacted, which will mean a massive assault, if it actually comes to pass, which I don't think he has the power to do, massive assault on American civil liberties. Here, this is Trump at the kind of neocon America First group he spoke to yesterday.
And defend our Jewish citizens in America. My first week back in the Oval Office, my administration will inform every college president that if you do not end anti-Semitic propaganda, they will lose their accreditation and federal taxpayer support. Okay. Truth is, you don't have to do much after that. When you do that, it's going to work miracles. Please sit down. We will not subsidize the creation of terrorist sympathizers, and we're not going to do it certainly on American soil. We're not going to do it anywhere. Next, I will inform every educational institution in our land that if they permit violence, harassment, or threats against Jewish students, the schools will be held accountable for violations of the civil rights law. Very important. Jewish Americans must have equal protection under the law. They're going to get it. At the same time, my administration will move swiftly to restore safety for Jewish students and Jewish people on American streets.
Look at the NBC News Chiron doing Trump's work for him.
I was noticing that.
Trump addresses hate speech on college campuses. So that's NBC News basically endorsing Trump's phony message that he's taking on hate speech. Well, what he's really doing is announcing he's going to pursue the censorship of people who oppose genocide on college campuses. And this after the Republicans took advantage of the Democrats' assaults on free speech in seeking the censorship of social media and pretended as if they were the party of free speech. Well, this is Trump saying he's going to target the free speech of anybody who supports Israeli genocide.
Right. And he doesn't, I don't think he has the power to revoke collegiate accreditation.
Yeah. Yeah.
He doesn't have the power to do that. And then he's also proposed shutting down the Department of Education. So how are you going to shut down the Department of Ed and then impose these policies, federal policies on universities? Like what department will do it? Will there be a new department, like the Department of, I don't know, is there like a 3-letter acronym that would effectively capture what Trump is doing, like ZO something? I don't know. I guess I'm not allowed to say it. I don't know if, but yeah, I really feel unsafe in these streets out here as a Jew. I don't know about you. We definitely need to ban Students for Justice in Palestine. So we're going to see a massive attack on at least a rhetorical attack on the free speech rights of anyone who criticizes Israel under a second Trump term. And all the conservative free speech warriors are going to be revealed as hypocrites once again as they support it.
And again, it's not as if it's only Trump doing this. Biden also condemned the protesters on college campuses. So they all do this. And the question for Trump is whether he'll actually go, even further in carrying out the actions that he's threatening there to make, or whether that's just talk. But regardless, it just shows that no one can claim to care about civil liberties and free speech. They're all in lockstep in trying to suppress, censor, these brave young kids on college campuses who put their lives on the line, their bodies on the line to oppose genocide.
Definitely. I think we got time for one more segment if you're up for it.
Let me update one thing I said earlier. I talked about, Bernie Sanders and the controversy around him getting Joe Rogan's endorsement. Bernie did go on Joe Rogan in 2020, and somebody who was on the Bernie campaign who's watching the stream texted me and says it's the best thing we did in the 2020 campaign was going on Joe Rogan, and but yet for some progressives that was like a heretic, controversial act. So just an update to what I said.
It was, and having Joe Rogan's endorsement helps. It worked. I remember the attacks, the public attacks on Bernie from within his campaign for doing that, which really kind of suggested that the inertia of Bernie's campaign had gone off the rails by that point. And you saw these think tankers moving into the campaign, more professional class people, Bernie talking about Trump being a racist at the end instead of sticking to, the working class kitchen table message that brought him to where he is. So thanks for that reminder. We're nearing the twilight phase of Joe Biden's administration. He's now officially a lame duck, and it's the twilight of his life. And in the lame duck session, after Kamala lost, with Biden in the final stages, he has made it clear that he personally supports Israel's genocide and that he never would have done anything different. This began, or this was made clear first in an interaction with an Israeli reporter. A majority of Jewish Israelis would like to see a deal to get their captives out of the Gaza Strip, and there are protests in Tel Aviv, shutting down highways all the time, ferocious protests. And this Israeli reporter, Neria Kraus, was speaking to the sentiments of most Jewish Israelis right now by asking Joe Biden, do you think you could maybe do a ceasefire before Trump comes into office and brings in the most Israel first administration in U.S. history? And here's what Biden said.
President Biden, do you think that you can get a hostage deal by the end of your term?
You think you can get hit in the head by a camera behind you?
Listen to what he says. Do you think you could get hit in the head by a camera behind you? Like, what? What? He's basically wishing violence on a reporter for asking about a ceasefire, on an Israeli reporter, no less. And then, he issues a statement declaring his ironclad support for Israel. Ironclad. The commitment to Israel is ironclad. And here's him welcoming President Isaac Herzog, who has said that there is no difference between civilians in Gaza and Hamas, who's called for genocide openly, whose statement is part of, I think, the ICJ filing.
You've been an incredible friend of Israel and the Jewish people for decades. And we will never forget, ever in history, how you stood up with us in our darkest hour. Thank you very much.
Thanks for being here, pal.
So there it is. I mean, he's getting his congratulations for the total destruction of Gaza, which is ongoing, with famine being confirmed by every aid agency operating there. The United Nations Independent Inquiry Commission finding Israel culpable of genocide just yesterday. And Aaron, there was a letter that Lloyd Austin and Pentagon Secretary and Tony Blinken issued before the election, which was to be released earlier this week, which had a deadline earlier this week, ordering Israel to supposedly allow more humanitarian aid into Gaza. What happened there?
Well, the deadline came and went, and Antony Blinken immediately announced that the U.S. would do nothing. That even though every aid group on the ground says that Israel is still blocking humanitarian aid, Antony Blinken said that there would be no consequences. And recall that this letter, it didn't explicitly threaten consequence. It said there might be consequences, right? So even that was an early sign that this was a toothless threat, likely timed to the campaign to for the Biden-Harris team to pretend as if they were holding Israel to account until after the election. And now the election comes and goes, and in line with their policy of this last year plus, their supposed efforts with Israel to get it to ease its siege of Gaza are completely toothless, and this is totally in line with who they are.
Yeah, and so here's Karine Jean-Pierre, White House press secretary, addressing the fact that the deadline was never enforced and that this letter was basically an election season ruse to convince some members of the Democratic Party base who are upset about the policy of underwriting genocide, that they might actually do something to end the starvation, the deliberately enforced starvation in the northern Gaza Strip, which is part and parcel of Israel's ethnic cleansing policy.
Today, there are multiple international aid agencies that say that Israel has failed to address the concerns and that the situation is even more dire than a month ago. Does the administration think that Israel has taken enough steps, or do you agree with these aid organizations and their assessment?
So a couple of things. Let me just take a look back at the last 30 days. Israel has taken steps to address the measures laid out in that letter from the two Secretaries Blinken and also Austin. And we are in a discussion with the Israelis about both the important steps Israel has taken as a result of the United States intervention, as well as additional steps that need to be taken. So those conversations continue, those discussions continue. And we, the United States, is indeed the largest provider of humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people. And so we are going to continue to do everything that we can to surge humanitarian assistance in Gaza. We understand how important it is, and in your question, we understand how dire that is. So ultimately, the long-term solution here to alleviate the suffering of the Palestinian people in Gaza is bringing an end to this war.
They've been saying that for months and months, along with that they're fighting for a ceasefire. They're in the, they're almost in the end zone for a ceasefire. They're working tirelessly. And now it's clear they never meant to do it. It's just confirmed. The destruction and horror that we're witnessing from Gaza is something on a scale that I've never seen. And they did it. So I don't know what could be worse from the Trump administration, at least with respect to Gaza. I'm not sad to see these people go at all. And they clearly paid a price for this. And they're still lying. They're still lying when they have no reason politically to do so anymore.
You go, but like if you go month by month throughout the genocide, it's the same rhetoric every single month. We're having conversations with the Israelis. Yes, they're not doing enough, but we expect them to. We are surging aid to Gaza. Yeah. They've used that term surge multiple times, but no aid is getting through. It's so malicious. One of the worst crimes in human history unfolding before our eyes. And yeah, I mean, for this reason alone, they deserve to lose. There's no doubt that Trump will be just as bad, but this is just one of, this is a defenseless camp. There's no air defenses in Gaza, no tanks, no air force to defend these people. And the Biden administration facilitated the destruction of the home of more than 2 million people over the last year. And they're going out the door just as they've been doing for the last year, just lying about it and pretending to care about the people that they're starving and killing. And she says there, no one's given more humanitarian support to the
so generous.
Yeah. No one's given more weapons to Israel than the Biden administration to kill these people. So what is she talking about?
Yeah. What is she talking about? She's reading talking points handed to her by the Biden White House because they're persisting with their lies. And let this be a lesson. Let this be a lesson to anyone else who seeks the Democratic presidential nomination or seeks the votes of Americans. This helped cost them the election. I got to call it. Aaron, anything you want to add?
Thanks for being here, everybody. We're going to be back here a lot now, and there'll be a lot, so what, 2 months left of Biden, and then on to the Trump era part 2.
Is it exhausting or what? I mean, it just feels like we can't escape. We can't be unburdened by what has been.
We cannot. To quote Kamala, no, we cannot.
But I don't know what else I'm going to do because I'm a journalist, which means I don't have any actual skills. So what else? So we're just going to be here.
We do have one of the most important fake jobs in the world, I think. And that is to cover all this madness, and we'll continue to do that. Absolutely. As
Matt Taibbi says, we're members of the talentless middle class. All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining. If you haven't liked this stream, please do so because we're heavily suppressed and demonetized. Definitely follow us at Rumble and subscribe. We just crossed 400,000 subscribers on YouTube. So thank you all so much for making that possible, and support us in any way you can. We still have at Spot Fund the crowdfunder for Jeremy Lafredo so he can continue producing consequential journalism into 2025. Thanks again for your support. Thanks for being here. We'll see you all next week. Peace.
Peace.